Yes, Mr. Hill.
Dr. Snape, I just want to pick up on the discussion that we were having before the break about the interaction between the actual pool sizes and the maximum pool sizes permitted as per the labels and the regulatory documentation. If we could have on screen, Sully, please. On the left-hand side is the document that we looked at before the break, BPLL 309120, page 3, which is the data taken from the batch numbers showing the plasma weight at various points between 1975 and 1989. And on the right-hand side is a table from the inquiry, Council to the Inquiry's presentation on pool sizes at the Blood Products Laboratory, which was given last week. For record, the reference is INQ 40345, page 7. Now, the second of those documents is not one that you have seen or been provided with. And if you would like to look at it and if you have any comments on it, then please do take your time to read it in due course and provide us with any comments, either in your oral evidence or in writing afterwards. But because it has arisen now, I'm going to bring it to your attention to see where we can go to with it. And I stress that any errors that are contained in that document are the errors of Council to the Inquiry and not your errors.
If you want to have a look at the underlying documents, then Mr. Hill may be able to arrange that, perhaps.
We certainly can, sir, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. If I could just continue or try to help with the discussion that we closed with just before the break. The tranche of documents that you sent me a week or so ago, which included BPLL 009120, the table of number of donations in Factor 8 produced at Elstree. There was a second document in that tranche, which is CBLA 004791. I don't know if it's possible to display that document, and I may be able, I hope, to explain some of my stumbling before the break.
Just before we do, could I just ask you a couple of questions about the documents that we have on screen? But I will take you back to
please.
4791 and indeed an additional document as well.
Please.
So the table on the right-hand side shows the maximum pool size. The table on the left-hand side, the actual pool size for each of those batches that have been fractionated. The maximum pool sizes, the dates given for them, are not dates necessarily on which they changed. It's just that we have data from that date which says that that was what the maximum pool size was. The first of those is the 27th of October 1980, and the maximum pool size then is said to be 5,000 donations. If we go across to the table on the left-hand side, we can see that in August 1980, the number of donations was approximately 3,000, and in March 1981, it was approximately 4,500. So underneath that 5,000 donations, but with some headroom, as it were, between the actual amount of donations and the maximum number of donations. The next piece of data that we have is from the 25th of January 1982, and we can see that the maximum pool size at that stage has gone up to 7,500 donations. And if we correlate that to the table on the left-hand side, we can see that by July 1982, the number of donations has gone up to approximately 6,000. So again, underneath the maximum pool size, and again, some headroom. Now, we have heard in evidence about the work done on the stopgap redevelopment of Building 25 within BPL, and how that increased the capacity to fractionate plasma at the old BPL. Is it likely that that increase in the maximum pool size from 1980 to 1982 reflects the fact that more plasma is being processed at BPL as a result of the stopgap redevelopment?
Yes, and of course that was only possible with the increased amount of plasma being supplied at that time. So it's a combination of factors. But yes, the answer to your question is that's certainly a factor.
Now, I appreciate this is before your time at BPL. You were still at PFL at this time. One interpretation of the two sets of figures is that there was a decision taken that the maximum pool size should be set somewhere above the actual fractionation number in order to allow for some leeway. Is that a fair interpretation?
It's a fair interpretation, and it's an interpretation that I wanted to go on and evoke with the later document I was going to ask to be viewed.
Let's come to that via this route, because the next step up is to 10,000 donations in June 1985. We can see on the table on the left-hand side that in July 1985 it was still 6,000 donations approximately, and it increases to about 7,000 by November 1986, and not until February 1988 do we get to the 10,000. By 1988, as we go back to the table on the right-hand side, we can see that the donor limit has been raised to 25,000 donations. The reference for the data about 10,000 donations is a document at CBLA 302190, which you have been provided with. And I'd like to go to that first before coming to the second document, which is CBLA 304791, which is the one that you've just raised with me. This is CBLA 302190 on screen now. It is a memorandum from you on the 10th of June 1985, sent to Mr. Prince and copied to Dr. Lane and Dr. Smith. You wrote the following: coagulation factor batch sizes. Further to your memo of the 25th of April 1985, I have assumed that a limit of 10,000 donations maximum will not restrict operations in the present building, but that an extension to 20,000 donations maximum will be required for the new facility. The higher figure will be used in any product license applications. So that's the 10th of June 1985. And then if we turn over to CBLA 304791, finally, I'm afraid, getting to the document that you asked me to take you to. This is the 20th of June 1986, so a year later, from you to Mr. Prince and Dr. Smith, copied to a number of others. And this is a document that we looked at a little earlier today as well, which says Dr. Lane has agreed that the maximum pool size may be extended to 25,000 donations for heat-treated coagulation factor concentrates. The appropriate label revisions will be made as soon as possible. Please check that any manufacturing document is revised before the increased limit is implemented. So having brought those documents up on screen, what is it that you take from those?
Thank you very much. If we could go back to the to CBLA 002190, yeah, and the previous memo. Yes. In thinking about the discussion before the break, I knew that there was a piece of paper that made sense of, at least I thought it made sense. This is a classic example of attempting to future-proof. And when one relates it to the table in BPL Treble 09120, you've just yourself pointed out that the 10,000 donations maximum that was in place was comfortably above the process that was actually being operated by Peter Prince up to April '85. When we looked forward to the new facility, I had to assume that we would want to extend or to increase process pool size, not necessarily individual processing batch size, but the pool size. And that's the origin of my 20,000 donations maximum to be used in the new facility. The last sentence is important because product license applications don't happen overnight. And I had to assume that we needed to anticipate probably a 6 months plus delay while we phrased an appropriate product license application with a larger pool size, and that had to be in place before we needed to use it. So the shift to 20,000 donations that was requested made sense, anticipating the batch sizes that were going to be manufactured in Building 27 once that facility was operating. And of course, the last 4 batches in the table in BPLL 0009120 are all batches, the FHC batches that are manufactured in the new facility. They're all heat-treated concentrates manufactured in Building 27. So I was a little slow, I think, recognizing that particular connection, but I hope that assists the chair in understanding at least the data that's available.
It certainly is very helpful. There may be a further point, if I may. Can we just have a look on the screen at BPLL 309120 again?
Page 3.
Can I ask, is there a gap between the date of manufacture and the date of release?
Yes.
Roughly how long a gap was there? It may have varied, I take it, from time to time, but roughly how long?
It would be somewhere between 6, date of manufacture being when the plasma is thawed, to date of release could be as much as 10 weeks. That would be conditioned. Obviously, there's the ongoing processing. A batch where the plasma pool is thawed on day 1. That batch might be in as final product in vials, heated and ready for inspection, labeling and packing, possibly 3 weeks later. After that, then the sampling takes place, and the sampling includes samples taken for BPL-QC to do testing, and for samples and protocols to go to an IBSC for testing and release. So some of those tests would take longer than others, and hence my 10 weeks from thawing the plasma to the product being available.
So the dates of release are the dates which are quoted in the document. The date of manufacture, which would therefore involve the maximum pool size of the time, presumably, would be 2 or 3 months earlier.
Yes, but it's the date of release that would dictate the statement, the label to be used for a particular batch.
I see. So there's not very much likelihood, though there may be some, of the maximum limit changing between the manufacture, in the sense of the processing, and the date of release.
I think you're right, sir.
Yep. Well, that's resolved that for me. Thank you very much.
Just two very quick follow-ups on that. Before the break, the chair took you to paragraph 109 of your statement. I don't ask that it's brought up, but that's where you used the figure of 7,500, saying that the donor pool size had just been increased in 1982 to 7,500. From the table that we're looking at here, we can see that the actual number of donations was around 6,000 in July 1982. And the table that we were looking at a little earlier shows that the maximum pool size went up to 7,500 donations by January 1982. So should we read the figure in paragraph 109 to be a reference to the maximum pool size rather than the actual pool sizes?
Do you mind if I just look at the page itself?
Of course, it's page 39 of your statement.
Yes, yes, you should.
For future reference for core participants and for the chair, if one wants to understand how much plasma is actually being processed at BPL in the various pools in this period, which is the best source of data of the two that we've just been looking at so far as you are concerned?
The plasma weight, as in table 1B there, would be what I would use and would suggest should be used.
That is at BPLL 309120, page 3 for the record. Final question, I promise, on pool size, at least from me. From July 1982 in this table until July 1985, we see that the same plasma weight is given for the 3 batches that are fractionated, 1,200 kilograms. Was that the function of the size of a plant, of the amount that B25 could process at that time, or was that a function of a deliberate decision to hold the batch weight at that level, or was it both?
No, I think it was the former. It was the batch manufacturing record would have defined and recorded the amount of plasma processed. There would have been no reason to feel constrained by the donor pool, the licensed donor pool limit that went on the label. It was simply what was practically achievable during that period in the factory.
I'm going to turn then to the labels themselves. Sorry, I think you're about to say something.
Yes, if I may. Yeah, I was a little slow when you asked me earlier about what was the defence. How did BPL see patients being protected if, in the absence of a test or screening test for non-A, non-B hepatitis, what did we have that we were relying on other than pool size? And of course, what I should have pointed out is that the plasma that we were processing was, at that time, certainly typically plasma recovered from individual plasma donations. And our plasma was, even by then, being subjected to, if not a quarantine period, at least an inventory hold of the frozen plasma before it was processed. The significance of that with recovered plasma is the inventory hold allows a period during which any post-transfusion sequelae of patients who had received the cells from which that plasma had been recovered could be recorded and notified to BPL so that we could interdict individual plasma donations if they were associated with post-transfusion hepatitis. And we regularly did. My own experience, my memory of that experience was that hardly a month went by when we were not interdicting individual plasma donations and preventing them from being processed after we'd had post transfusion sequelae reported from centres. And in fact, a comment certainly from one quite senior medicines inspector visiting BPL, and when we were talking about the way that allowed us to retrieve plasma was, well, you hardly need to mimic that situation. You're doing it often enough that I can see that the process works.
Thank you for that, Dr. Snape. We're going to come back to the plasma hold period in due course, and I'm conscious that some of the evidence that you have given there is given in your statement, and there is a helpful document as well. I will dig up those references at lunchtime so that we can place them on the transcript.
Thank you.
For now, I'd like to turn to labels. Could I begin by asking what role you played in the production of the labels that were placed on the products produced by PFL and BPL?
Yes. First of all, it changed over time. At PFL, even up to 1982, we adopted the practice that product labels were generated or overprinted if we were using commercially produced labels, were generated or overprinted by QC. And that's quite unusual. And I recall inspection comments when it was pointed out that this was unusual, that was a production activity, and surely this was QC crossing the boundary between the QC role and the production role. Well, when I explained that what we were doing was making sure that, given the nature of production activities in PFL and the people involved, that in fact the individuals better placed to do it were the people in the control laboratory. In fact, the clerks who were managing data for me. The inspector accepted that this was a case of getting the right people to do the job rather than slavishly following guidance. At BPL, it was properly different. We had an inspection, labeling and packing department, and the labels were certainly for licensed products, the labels were prepared by a commercial company, commercial press, and the role of my role, the role of QC, was to review copy for the labels before they were sent to the press, and approve sample labels from the roll when they came back from printing. But from that point on, the labels were managed and administered in the inspection, label and packing department, and the role of QC was to ensure by regular audit that the labels were being stored appropriately and selected appropriately for use.
Who would have made the final decision on the wording that would be used, particularly in terms of warnings about viral risk?
Label copy was reviewed by a group. We operated what we loosely called a starburst mechanism, whereby copy went to the same time to as many contributing individuals as possible, typically electronically, by email, and then comments came back into that group. The final decision on what was stated on it would have been probably my role as the person chairing that group.
You mentioned email there, so obviously that's a little later in time. If we think about the mid-1980s, who would have had the final say at that time?
It would have been a discussion between myself and the production manager, and we would always have drawn in Dr. Lane if we felt that there was a change that needed a medical review, but that was often not necessary. There would be mechanical changes rather than in principle changes that made a difference.
Would you consult external agencies, the Medicines Agency, NIBSC, the DHSS, about the wording of the warnings that were contained on the labels in the mid-1980s?
Not NIBSC, but certainly the MCA, as would have been involved in those discussions, and once we had a European Medicines Agency, I would have also consulted with them.
You say the MCA, would its predecessor, the Medicines Division of the DHSS, also have been involved at the earlier stage?
In the same way. For me, that transition from Medicines Division of DHSS to MCA was a fairly seamless transition.
Who were the labels intended for? Was it for the clinician or for the patient?
Sorry, who
were the labels intended for? Were they intended for the clinician or for the patient or for both?
When we were considering the content of the labels, we considered both. It's important to remember that a lot of the product that we issued was distributed, the product in the case of Factor VIII was distributed from transfusion centres to the haemophilia centres, and then a lot of that material was issued for home therapy. So the product would have been, the Factor VIII product would have been in patients' fridges.
I'm going to bring up a sheet which shows 3 labels, and the dates are given on the sheet, though we cannot verify them ourselves. It's BPLL 302039. Please, Sully. If we could expand the top label, please. This is stated to be pre-June 1985. I don't know how clearly you'll be able to see it. On the left-hand side, we can see the wording less than 7,500 plasma donations were used in the preparation of this batch. We've spoken about that, and I won't ask you any more questions. We can see that the label which has been attached to this by somebody, and we don't know who, suggests that this is an HL product, so the BPL product. It is stated to be dried factor VIII fraction of intermediate specific activity, which, as I understand it, would fit with it being an HL product. The warning, which is highlighted in blue on the package, reads as follows, and I quote, "The preparation is of human origin and cannot be assumed to be free of hepatitis virus." First of all, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it. I can also see just below it, on the right hand of the centre panel, the designation HL5. So the nature of the label is defined there.
So that is
the line that says store in the dark below +6 degrees C, to the right of that there is a designation HL5, and that's where the typescript above derives.
The warning about
yes.
hepatitis. First of all, do you think that the date given there, pre-June 1985, is likely to be accurate?
Yes.
Why is it that that warning contains no reference to AIDS?
I guess the simple answer is that that warning would have been found, I'm sure, on previous sequences of labels, and we did not add a specific reference to AIDS virus at that stage. I'm sure you're right that by the end of 1984, we could have added and HTLV3 or HIV as a statement. I can't tell you now why we didn't.
Do you know if there was any discussion about adding a warning about HTLV3 or HIV?
I don't recall such a discussion. I think I would have recalled it had it occurred.
How often were the words for the label reviewed at BPL at that time?
Probably not more than twice a year, unless there was a specific, and the most specific reason for doing so would have been the donation limit.
But we have seen that the donation limit did increase to 7,500 in 1982, and it still appears to have been at 7,500 by 1985. But notwithstanding that, you think that there would have been some form of review of the labels a couple of times a year. Is that right?
In that particular case, I suspect probably not. The only reason for changing would have been if it was considered to be deficient. It's the label would be part of the product license application, the PL numbers there at the bottom left-hand corner of the center panel, and we would not have set about making changes without a very good reason.
Do you remember anyone raising the lack of an AIDS warning on the label with you? Clinicians, patients, the DHSS, anybody?
No.
You say that you wouldn't have made changes without a very good reason. The developing knowledge of HIV and AIDS, life-threatening disease, would have been a good reason, wouldn't it, to have included a warning?
It would have been a good reason if it could be expected to result in a change in clinical practice. I'm not sure. I struggle to see that clinical practice would have changed as a result of drawing a specific attention to HIV, HTLV3. I would I would have favoured, if we were going to change that at all, to change it to something like cannot be assumed to be free of viruses transmissible by blood. But I'm not convinced that adding HTLV3 or HIV to that would have changed the way people thought about the product.
The way in which people thought about the product in clinical practice is something that is outside of your control. What is inside your control at BPL is the label that you put on a product that BPL produces. Looking back, do you think that that label should have had a warning that at least allowed sufficient space for AIDS and HIV to be included within the warning?
You're asking me to indulge in 2020 hindsight. The answer is, at the moment, I'm not convinced.
You're not convinced that it was necessary for BPL in the mid-1980s to have included a warning about HIV and AIDS on the label of its product?
Because pre-June 19... We're at the cusp, aren't we, there, of when individual physicians were convinced of the etiology of AIDS transmission. Should we? I would need to reflect. I'm sorry.
We'll come on a little bit later to the date of knowledge about AIDS, and perhaps we'll return to that conversation when we have done so. But you've given your answers for now. There would have been an information sheet provided with the vials as well. We saw that in the video being packed in the same package. Are you able to say whether further detail was given about hepatitis and/or AIDS in the information sheet in the mid-1980s?
I haven't had access to the package insert leaflets during the time that I've been preparing my witness statement. And I simply don't remember back 35 years to what was in a PIL at that time. It would have been subjected to exactly the same review as the label at the time. So it would have been consistent with the label.
If we could turn then to the next label, please. This is a label which is clearly for 8Y. We can see that's mentioned there. The date's given of June 1985 to February 1987. The warning section states this: the preparation is of human origin, less than 10,000 plasma donations used per batch. It has been subjected to heat treatment in the vial to reduce the risk of infection by viral agents, including hepatitis and AIDS viruses, but cannot be assumed to be free of the risk of infection. First of all, do you have any recollection of how the change came to be made and the discussions that went into the change of label?
Do I have a recollection? No, but what I would have expected to happen is that the print copy group would have taken into account the nature of 8Y, and I'm sure that I would have discussed with Dr. Smith the phraseology, particularly because of the nature of 8Y and the extent to which we could make a claim for virus inactivation resulting from the HT3 treatment.
Finally, if we could turn to the last label. This is dated from February 1987 onward. It is said to be for product FHC1. It is, the warning states this: the preparation is of human origin. It has been heat treated in the vial to reduce the risk of infection by viral agents, including hepatitis and AIDS virus, but it cannot be assumed to be free from the risk of transmission of viral infections. Firstly on this, do you know why the reference to donor numbers has been removed from the label?
I do know that a decision was taken, and I think it's picked up in the tranche of papers that you sent to me last week. So it was a conscious decision. It wasn't an omission to eliminate the donation limit. But beyond that, no. I'm sure we felt that it had reached the stage that by then the donation limit had contributed nothing, either to physicians' awareness or patient awareness of risk. If I can make the comment,
of course.
I think probably that donation limit could have been removed from the label even before this. Certainly, once we reached the 10,000 donation limit, it was hardly relevant or hardly helpful to physicians or patients.
The other addition to this label is that of a barcode. I think that we saw in the video that there was a scanning system. Is that part of the automation and computerization of the new BPL?
Part of that, but it's also was part of our arrangement with the print company that generated them. The barcode gave an extra level of security in terms of identifying roll labels.
If we could take that down then, please, Sully, and turn from the labels to the question of knowledge of HIV and AIDS, and of course HDLV3, as the terminology was at the time. If we could go, please, to WITN 3431001, page 63. This is from your statement, paragraph 176. You wrote, in July 1982, the first report of AIDS-related symptoms associated with a haemophiliac patient was published, and fractionators, like haemophilia treaters, were very concerned about whether the causative agent of AIDS could be transmitted through clotting factor concentrates. Of course, until the causative agent had been identified and characterized, it was not possible to conclude that heat treatment of concentrates would help to prevent transmissions of AIDS to haemophiliacs. Are you able to say now when you first became aware of that July 1982 report, which I think was from MMWR, the publication from the Centers for Disease Control of the United States?
Probably within several months, but what I would say was that I was also conscious of the fact that, first of all, in the US at the time, there was a considerable agnosticism about the whether the AIDS syndrome was a result of virus transmission, or whether it was something associated with the practices of homosexuals, like use of nitrites or whatever. So I think it was not certainly my consciousness, my awareness of confirmed relationship between AIDS and as a transmissible, an agent transmissible by blood, didn't come until well into 1983.
Do you think that, well, sorry, I'll ask it in a more neutral way, that you're talking about yourself there. What about colleagues at BPL? Do you think that they had a similar journey, or did they arrive at that destination sooner or later than you?
I don't think colleagues at BPL would necessarily have I don't think they would have arrived there sooner than me. I think I would in turn have relied on discussions with Dr. Smith, Dr. Ritzer, and feedback from John Krask's working party to give me confidence. But I think, like many fractionators, I would have been skeptical about the coincidence of the number of transmissions to haemophilic patients as being just dismissible as being a coincidence.
I think
I don't. Sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, I think in your Lindsay evidence, I won't take you to it, but the reference is LIND 40311, and it's page 14. I think you refer to fractionators taking a pessimistic view, as it were, that there may well be a link. Is that right?
Yes, and I think we did, and it was proper that we did.
I'm going to take you now to a document that the inquiry has seen before and you have been provided with. It's CBLA 301691. CBLA 301691.
Whilst that document's being found, can I just qualify what I just said?
Please do.
When I said pessimistic, I interpret pessimistic as meaning we had to assume that there was a likelihood that AIDS was the result of a virus transmissible by blood. That kind of pessimism.
That is how I had understood your evidence, but thank you.
Yeah.
This document is a memo, from the 24th of March 1983, dictated by Dr. Lane and signed in his absence, sent to Mr. Mallory and to a number of other people, including you and Dr. Smith. It says this, AIDS. Professor Bloom drew to the attention of the CBLA at their meeting on Wednesday, the 23rd of March, for problems that are becoming associated with blood transfusion and blood product administration with the increased incidence of reported AIDS cases, which continue to gain momentum in the United States on a monthly basis. The high mortality in reported cases is a cause for concern and is a primary factor behind what is described as the American overreaction to the problem. The etological factor or factors remain unknown. If we go a little further down the document to the fourth paragraph, Dr. Lane describes what Professor Bloom and Gunson have been doing and refers to patients at risk in the United Kingdom, notably people with haemophilia. He then goes on to say this: it is necessary for this laboratory to develop a policy which may only be implemented on a short-term basis, which will allow for the presentation of a large proportion of NHS factor VIII as cryoprecipitate. Staff will be aware that many regional transfusion centres have not made wet cryoprecipitate for some time, would now both be out of practice and in some cases without the facilities to recommence large-scale production. The implications for BPL source material are very real. A meeting involving those circulated with this memorandum should be set up at the earliest convenient opportunity to discuss the strategic...
I think we're missing that on the screen.
Sorry, we could go on to the following paragraph. Forgive me, I've read ahead. A meeting involving those circulated with this memorandum should be set up at the earliest convenient opportunity to discuss the strategic alternatives at BPL for manufacturing small pool freeze-dried cryoprecipitate to offset the requirements for manufacturing at BTS level. Considerable adjustments to resources should be envisaged and taken account of. Equally, a temporary fractionation programme commencing with cryoprecipitate supernatant from the BTCs should also be taken into consideration. The implications concerning factor IX production will need to be examined, and the potential benefits of pasteurisation of factor IX given some priority. So that is Dr. Lane's memorandum, and we can see what has prompted it. Are you able to assist with who was describing the American overreaction to the problem?
A group of physicians in the US whose names, but it would the names that come to mind would be Professor Harold Roberts from North Carolina, and two or three others who were really, and when I referred earlier to agnosticism about AIDS as a blood transmissible virus, I was thinking of that group. And I'd even include, certainly at the time, for example, of this memo in March '83, I recall that David Aronson at the Bethesda, the Bureau of Biologics at Bethesda, was still not convinced that AIDS was a transmissible virus. And I presume that the American overreaction to the problem referred to a committee that met not just in respect of AIDS, but other things and discussed what should be done. And that committee was stout in its objection to change in guidance, for example, to plasma donor centres, exclusion of individuals whose sexual behaviour put them at risk of transmission. That committee was opposed to anything that might reduce the production of plasma for fractionation without proper evidence that this was a transmissible virus. That's probably. I have actually. I think I've referred to it in parts in my witness statement, but I'd need time to pull it up and point you to it.
Should we read then that sentence not as meaning that Dr. Lane considered there to have been an American overreaction, but that he was referring to the fact that others, including those clinicians that you have mentioned, considered it to be an overreaction?
That's the way I read it, yes.
In the third paragraph, the final sentence, Dr. Lane wrote this: equally, there is a likelihood that a return to cryoprecipitate as a desirable form of treatment may become irresistible, whether logical or not. Can you assist with what he meant by those last words, whether logical or not?
I think so. My view, and I think others who he was addressing on that list would have taken the view that practically BPL would have found it very difficult to assist the transfusion service in creating a supply of freeze-dried cryoprecipitate for treatment as an alternative to freeze-dried concentrates. And I think that's the kind of logic that he was referring to, that it might be attractive, but would be extremely difficult. And I'm not saying expensive, I'm just saying extremely difficult to do.
That is a practical consideration. Is it possible that logical was hinting at something else? That Dr. Lane was suggesting that a return to cryoprecipitate wouldn't do much good in terms of reducing the exposure to a potential virus?
Well, I think if that's what he was thinking, I think he was right on that as well, because it became quite clear as time passed that the virus had become part of our donor population, just in the same way that non-A, non-B hepatitis had. And certainly the recall that I've referred to separately in another part of my witness statement indicated was an example of a England and Wales blood donor who donated blood, presumably convinced that he wasn't a source of risk, and he wouldn't have been the only one.
We will come on to that later, the HL 1386 incident. But that, if we take that as an example, that donor gave his blood donations, and one of those came into BPL and was fractionated into many hundreds of vials of factor VIII concentrate, which went out to patients. If that plasma had been used in the form of cryoprecipitate, it would have been a single donor use, would it not? Would that not have reduced the risk?
If we're talking about single donor cryoprecipitate, of course, it would only have infected the one patient who was unfortunate enough to receive it.
But do you think this may also be reflecting on freeze-dry cryoprecipitate, which would not be single donor? Is that correct?
It didn't have to be single donors. It might have provided one way of providing a supply, a reduced risk supply based on smaller donors in the pool.
Obviously, we haven't got Dr. Lane to ask him those questions, which is why I explore it a little with you, but recognise, of course, that you cannot speak for him. The memorandum as a whole reads as if it is inviting thought and discussion to be given to the question of what BPL should do if there is this departure in course and a reversion to cryoprecipitate. Some of the issues that Dr. Lane raises for consideration are the use of cryoprecipitate supernatants from the BTCs, the blood transfusion centres. Am I right in reading that as meaning that if the...
Could we just have the document back on screen, please?
CBL A301691.
Thank you. And they were asking about particular wording on this document.
Penultimate paragraph, please. We can see towards the end of that paragraph, he speaks about the yes, sorry, I lost my place. But equally, a temporary fractionation program commencing with cryoprecipitate supernatant from BTCs should also be taken into consideration. Am I right in understanding that to mean that if the regional transfusion centres were producing their own cryoprecipitate for factor VIII patients, BPL was still going to be asked to produce other blood products, and in order to produce those blood products, they would require the supernatant from the regional transfusion centres to be provided to BPL?
It would have, if that had transpired, it would have been possible to receive cryoprecipitate supernatant from transfusion centres, and that could have been used for recovery of factor IX and factor VII, and of course for albumins and immunoglobulins. But a change in practice that would have needed, the BPL would have needed to adjust to, and would almost certainly have taken us back to receipt of that cryoprecipitate supernatant in 5-litre bags, with the pooling of the supernatant into those bags being undertaken at the transfusion centres, which would be some better placed to do so under GMP conditions.
GMP is good manufacturing practice.
Yes, sorry.
To some original transfusion centres would have been in a better position to have done that according to the best standards at the time than others.
Yes, indeed. But then in 1983, BPL was hardly best placed to talk about process GMP, given the facility of Building 25.
We'll come on to the meeting perhaps after lunch, but just one final question from me on this document. Is this, to the best of your memory, the first time that you can recall a discussion or a structured discussion taking place about the reversion, the possibility of a reversion to cryoprecipitate and the effect that that would have on BPL?
It's the first document, and if you look at the first, I mean, you've already addressed the first two paragraphs. It's clear that there wasn't a consensus in the UK that AIDS was a transmissible virus. So not surprising that it was the first document of its kind.
So I've reached the end of that document.
Yes, well, that's now will be a good time for a break, I think. So shall we take a break until 2:10? 2:10.
Thank you, sir.